Hello, welcome to our 9 a.m. press conference, Ecosystem Impacts of Record Ocean Warming in the North Pacific. Our speakers today will be Nate Mantua, Landscape Ecology Team Leader, Fisheries Ecology Division, NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center, Chao, Principal Scientist, Remote Sensing Solutions, and Raphael Kudela, Professor of Ocean Sciences, Benson, Lynn, Professor of Ocean Health at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
Okay. All right, I am going to give you a brief overview of some of the very large-scale phenomena that's contributed to the warming along the Pacific coast in the last 2 years, and say a bit about where things appear to be headed in the next at least 6 months. You've probably heard a lot about the Blob, this large area of warm water in the Pacific, Northeast Pacific Ocean. The origins of the Blob can be traced back to changes in atmospheric patterns. This first pattern that I have shown here is sea level pressure anomalies for 2012. This would be, get it right, July of 2011 through June of 2013, so the 2-year period that were the beginning of California's drought years. And these high pressure areas offshore were very persistent, and that earned the nickname the ridiculously resilient ridge because it just wouldn't go away. It wouldn't allow storms to come to the west coast. Its big arrow is meant to indicate the surface wind pattern that is activated by that pressure feature, enhanced winds from the north along the Pacific coast. And in those 2 years, the first 2 years of California's drought, ocean temperature patterns in a broad area of the Northeast Pacific look like this picture at the right. So it's the same 2-year period. The blues are indicating colder than normal temperatures, and offshore you had actually higher than normal temperatures. And just notice that the high pressure more or less is on top of those warm areas. It's because it's suppressing the winds and reducing the loss of heat from the ocean to the atmosphere there, but in the cold areas it's actually enhancing the cooling of the ocean, both through drawing more heat out, increased evaporation, upwelling, and currents from the north towards the south. The next 2 years had an important shift in that atmospheric pressure and wind pattern, and this is for the years of 2014 through 2015. And you can see now the high pressure center has moved towards the Pacific Northwest coast, over British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, down into Oregon and Washington. It was also effective at keeping stores from California. There was low pressure to the north of Hawaii and then towards the Aleutians at the same time. The arrows that I've drawn there indicate a very different wind pattern. And that change in the wind pattern was especially good at slowing down some of the major areas of strong winds that create the normal conditions along our coastline. So ocean temperatures warmed dramatically, and this map shows what I term the warm blobs. This area in the Gulf of Alaska was the original warm blob that Nick Bond was talking about in his newsletter in June of 2014, where that name originated. But shortly after this one developed, in the early months of 2014, another warm area developed and has persisted off of the coast of Baja in Southern California, extending all the way to the Hawaiian Islands. This persistent warming in the Northeast Pacific has come with very widespread biological impacts. You see it in the plankton field with very sort of tropical, subtropical species like the sea butterfly, typically found in Baja, California, being sampled off of Bodega Bay, California last summer. Pelagic red crabs and other Baja California species washing up on the beaches a couple of times this fall in Monterey Bay area. Ocean sunfish, typically a subtropical species, found in Prince William Sound, Alaska, and throughout other parts of the Gulf of Alaska and all along the Pacific Northwest coast. Really hard times for California sea lions the last couple of years, in particular the nursing mothers and the pups having very difficult time getting nutrition, so record high strandings of California sea lions, and now high strandings for northern fur seals along the California coast. And of course the harmful algal bloom, which you're going to hear more about from Rafe in our press conference here. So El Nino is really important part of this story, not so much for how we got here. It's a lot more important, I think, for where we're headed in the next few months. These pressure patterns that created the exceptionally warm and record warm ocean temperatures in the Northeast Pacific in 2014 and 2015 are quite different than the sea level pressure and surface wind and weather pattern that is associated with strong El Nino events. And that's what's shown in this cartoon. In past El Nino winters, like in 1982-83 and certainly in 1997-98, the weather pattern had this situation with persistent low pressure in the entire Northeast Pacific, from Hawaii all the way to Alaska. And it brings this very intensified area of counterclockwise winds, and along the Pacific coast, that means strong winds out of the south or out of the southeast in the Gulf of Alaska. And those winds cause changes in ocean currents and the heat exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere that tend to warm the Northeast Pacific. And of course, this red band is indicating that we typically see a very active storm track just to the north of Hawaii that's aimed at California much more often than it is in an average winter. So we expect a very different weather pattern this winter if El Nino ends up having a dominant influence. If we look back at the history of tropical El Nino variability and west coast ocean temperatures, and in this case it's an area average of ocean temperatures from 500 kilometers towards the coast, from the U.S.-Canada border down to the U.S.-Mexico border. That's shown in this solid curve. The El Nino index, the Nino 3-4, is in the shading. And I just want to point out that in the last two exceptionally warm El Nino conditions, the 1982-83 and 1997-98 El Nino, we had sort of different effects in the California current system. You see this rapid warming that started after the El Nino really took off, and it persisted for another year into the summer and fall of 1984. During the 97-98 El Nino, they warmed simultaneously. If you look at more moderate events, there's a very mixed bag of associations. Sometimes California current warmed, sometimes it didn't. And if you look at this most recent exceptional warming and record high warming off the West Coast, you see that things happened here first. You know, we got out ahead of the tropical El Nino by about a year. So this is really different than what's happened in the past in terms of its timing and evolution. If you look at snapshots for where we are now compared to where we were in 1997 at the same time of year, there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some interesting differences. In December of 97, lots of warm water right along the coast, all the way into Alaska. And of course, the exceptional warming in the tropics, offshore, these blue areas colder than normal. In the far western tropical Pacific, it's colder than normal. This is what it looks like right now. We have that same signature of very warm water along much of the Pacific coast, and the signature warming on the equator as well, but it's much more extended to the west in the equatorial Pacific. It's not quite as warm as it was in 97 near the South American coast. And there's this much bigger, broader wedge of warm water that goes out to the Hawaiian Islands and beyond them that has been the sort of signature of the warm blobs of the last 2 years. So if you just do that again, you could just see how much more warm water there is in the North Pacific now than there was in 1997 at this time. So if the climate forecast is on track for El Nino effects on the weather patterns over the North Pacific, we might expect to see things transition towards where they were in midwinter of 1998, with concentrated warming along the Pacific coast and actually colder than average temperatures offshore. And that's because that wind pattern is actually going to, if it sets up, it's going to take a lot of heat out of the offshore waters, but it will cause increased onshore transport of surface waters, more transport from the south to the north, and more what we call coastal downwind. As that water accumulates along the coast, it pushes the thermocline down, and it actually brings warmer air over the ocean, which tends to reduce the heat fluxes. And it would continue to have this tropical, subtropical influence along the Pacific coast into at least next spring. If we look at the weather patterns of the just last month and a half, I thought it's pretty interesting to see that in the month of November, we have a weather pattern in terms of sea level pressure anomalies that looks extremely different, almost opposite to what the El Nino pattern we're looking for. High pressure between Hawaii and the mainland, enhanced winds out of the north, and in fact, these stronger than normal winds out of the north in the month of November took a pretty good bite out of the blob. It reduced the temperature anomalies in that broad area of the Northeast Pacific by about half of where they had been, so from about 3 degrees, 2 to 3 degrees to about 1 to 1.5. The last 2 weeks, the pattern has looked a lot more like the El Nino pattern that is typical with El Nino winters. Not exactly, it's more confined to higher latitudes, but it's closer. So that's something to keep an eye on. And my take-home message is the warm blobs were established before the tropical El Nino intensified. The proximate cause for the warming was unusual and persistent wind patterns. It's not obviously related to the tropical El Nino event. And El Nino influences on the West Coast are expected to intensify now through spring. If they do, we'll see a lot more of this sort of tropicalization of the West Coast ocean.
Do I close this? So Nate give you a really nice overview of the Pacific-wide picture from atmospheric patterns, blobs in the Pacific.
Is yours PDF?
It's PowerPoint.
PowerPoint, why is it not coming up? Okay, hold on.
To the El Ninos. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to the coastal ocean of California, talk about the specific of this warming, and then try to make some connection with this El Nino and the blob phenomena Nate described. I also tried to zoom in San Francisco Bay, which is less talk about compared to the coastal warming. So that's also pretty evidence as part of these as well.
Okay, there we go.
So I don't have to dwell on these motivations and then motivate us to do a very careful look at the warming in the coastal waters, just because we observe all this evidence, something happening in the ocean 2014 and an early part of 2015, as Nate said, almost a year before this big El Nino is coming up. So I plotted the El Nino time series, the same time series that Nate plotted up. This is the El Nino evolution. You can see the warming of the El Nino didn't really happen after the summer of 2015, only a few months ago. I know we are expecting the peak around the Christmas time in the next few weeks, and then eventually back to normal by next spring, like typical El Nino events happening. If you plot this El Nino time series on top of the California warming, this is the data from the Monterey mooring, kind of think about the index of the coastal warming in California in the green line. And you can see this El Nino warming already have signatures along the coast. You have this warming signal coming from the tropics, propagate along the coast and into our California waters. So you'll see some of these pulses and a warming signal already showing up. But what is evidence is a year ago, you have this significant, even warmer signal of the California coast. And that signal cannot be explained by the El Nino signal. It has something to do with blob in the North Pacific, as Nate described. So if you see a little bit more carefully this warming in the California coast, in the entire West Coast, is about 6 to 9 months behind what do you see in this blob in the North Pacific. So you have this lead time indicating predictability. So eventually, because of this memory of the ocean, have the 6 to 9 months, and then there is a potential even we can predict this coastal warming in the future as we understand this phenomena a little bit better. The warming doesn't really stop in the coastal water. So recently I investigate a couple of the data in the San Francisco Bay. So you just go through the Golden Gate, there's a couple of stations that monitor the time series. There's a Tiburon station, there's another ocean station on Cartines, and there's also monthly surveys by the USGS. Ships go out and then making all those stations from north to south, collecting water temperatures. And you can see from this 2009 to present, I shaded this area in the last a year and a half. And you can see start from early 2014 all the way to early 2015. And you have this 2 degrees warming inside the San Francisco Bay. And presumably coming from the Golden Gate. We did a more careful study from computer model showing all the heat coming through the coastal waters and then penetrate into the bay. So we expect, and there's also a significant impact to the bay physical environments, to the ecosystem, and the fishery related indices as well. In order to understand this phenomena, we also have been developing computer models, try to reproduce this warming both in the coastal areas, coastal of California, and also San Francisco Bay. Hopefully in the future, many years later, we were able to understand this phenomena, the origin, the processes, the physics, and then eventually we're going to predict, anticipate this warming, just like we are predicting El Nino now. Back in many months ago, we're anticipating a big El Nino is coming. So we can give this information to the decision makers, to the resource managers to plan and adapt and react. So just the preliminary results, I get all the warmings of the coastal and San Francisco Bay, and then I added the dashed line here is produced from our model. So our model is maturing, is to reproduce this phenomena in the computer. So like 20 years ago when I was in graduate school, very few people know about El Nino, but we tried to reproduce El Nino in the computer in the last 50 years. And then if we understand that better, we can try to handcast those events, 82, 83 El Nino, 97, 98. And then now you see predicting El Nino as routinely as weather prediction. You take granted for taking the iPhones to see the weather prediction for 10 days out. And El Nino now prediction, people accepted 6-9 months prediction. Hopefully 10 years later, 5 to 10 years, you're going to predicting the blobs, predicting the warming of the California coast, so it can anticipate the impact and adapt the policy to it. So in summary, California warming is in the middle of these 2 large-scale processes in the Pacific, El Nino in the tropics, Blob in the North Pacific. It's an interplay between these 2 major drivers, and sometimes they are synchronized in phase. Sometimes, like this last year's warming, they are out of phase. So California water respond to these 2 phenomena, and then the San Francisco Bay just passively receiving that heat, and then just try to reflect what's happening in the much bigger coast and a much bigger Pacific. So I stop here, and then Rafe will pick up the ecosystem impact. And
Right there.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the impacts have been on the ecosystem. And we were really fortunate. We had a large team funded by NOAA, and we were out in Monterey Bay, California, looking for these blooms, these big toxic blooms that you've probably heard about. And we happened to be there right at the beginning and could catch what was happening and see how it affected the biology and the ecosystem through time. And so what I'm going to show you is that, as you probably heard, there really truly are record-setting levels of this neurotoxin, Domoic acid, that responded to the conditions of both the warm blob and potentially the El Nino. Because the bloom lasted for so long, because it's been so warm for so long in California, we've started to see things that we've never seen before. One of them is that we're seeing toxin accumulating below the regulatory limit, but still accumulating in the fillet of commercial fish and other organisms. And I'll show you some examples of that. And we think that that is prolonging trophic transfer. And so that's leading to organisms like sea lions being exposed to this toxin over a much longer period than we thought was normal. We also think that the sediment is acting as a reservoir for this toxin. And so the toxin is still there in the environment for months and months after the bloom goes away. And this leads directly into the Dungeness crab closure. And we are pretty confident that the bloom is going to respond to El Nino in the same way that it responded to the warm blob. And so that we may be going, starting in 2014, we had a lot of toxin. 2015 was unprecedented. Going into 2016, our best prediction is that we could have an equally large or even larger bloom because of the El Nino. And so I'm starting with this background. This is the Monterey Bay Aquarium kelp forest tank, and I'm showing you this because the bloom was so persistent and so large that the aquarium actually had toxin in their tank for months this summer. It went all the way through their filter system, it went through their water system, and it got into the tank because the toxin levels in the water were up to 100,000 nanograms per liter. And that may not mean much to you, but that's about 100 times higher than where we start to get concerned for human health, for ecosystem health. Showing you just the records, and so these are only values where we've exceeded anything that anybody's ever seen before. We've had records in mussels, records in Dungeness crab, actually the Dungeness got even higher, records in rock crab, records in razor clam, and incredibly high values in anchovy. The regulatory limit is 20. And so anything over 20, they would start shutting down fisheries. And so you can see these values are 20 to 30 times higher in things like anchovy than are allowed for human consumption. And that has led, of course, to massive economic and ecological losses, the shutdown of the anchovy fishery, the shutdown of the crab fishery, and it's going to ripple through. It's going to continue to cause these problems. And so one of the things that we've been able to look at is when the domoic acid is in the water, it's produced by this algae called Pseudonychia. It's a diatom. We know that the diatom really likes these warm conditions. And so it's sort of a Goldilocks condition where it's getting some nutrients from upwelling, but it's being bathed in these warm waters. And it's being eaten by these fish like anchovy, planktivorous fish, that consume the algae, and they're using it as food. What we thought happened was they'd be consuming the algae, and within about 24 hours, it would leave the fish. It goes right through the viscera, and it doesn't really stay in the fish. And so if the bloom goes away, the expectation was it's going to go away in the fish within about 24 hours. What we've discovered is we did a fairly careful study with California Department of Public Health where CDPH captured anchovy. They flash froze them on the boat. They brought them back to the lab. We got them frozen. We dissected them out frozen. And the reason for keeping them frozen the whole way through was to make sure that we weren't simply letting the toxin spread through the fish as we thought and unthought it. And then we divided it up into the viscera, the stomach contents, where we thought all the domoic acid would be, the head and spinal cord and gills, just because the fish might have Pseudonychia stuck in its gills still. And then we rinsed everything else, which is basically the body, the part that you would eat if you eat anchovies. And we rinsed that really carefully. And then we looked at the toxin in each one of these. And so, as expected, the viscera are extremely toxic, over 2,000 parts per million. Again, 20 is the regulatory limit, and so this is really high. But the head and spine are up in 184. And the body, after you remove all of this and you've cleaned it really well, so this is the fillet essentially, is still over the regulatory limit. And so CDPH earlier this summer was saying, well, it's okay to eat the fish as long as you decapitate it. This shows that no, it's not okay to eat the fish after you decapitate it. The toxin is actually getting into the body and the fillet of the fish. And so then we looked a little bit further into the food web, and so anchovy are eating the Pseudonychia, the toxic algae, directly. There's many other organisms that are eating anchovy or eating other things, and we found toxin in pretty much everything we looked at. And so rockfish, market squid, lingcod, halibut, king salmon, coho salmon, mackerel, sardinops is another planktivorous fish. And so all of them have toxin in it. We got really interested in that, and we looked a little bit further. These are some fillets. This is a lingcod fillet. This is a halibut fillet where a fisherman caught this. They filleted it fresh. It was never frozen. We got the vacuum sealed bags, and we went in and looked at it, and what we found is in the red mussel, the more oxygenated bloody mussel, there's about a 10 to 100-fold increase in domoic acid in that part of the tissue. And so this is the part you eat. This is the part that something like a sea lion is eating as well. And so what it suggests is that instead of just simply passing through the gut, the domoic acid is actually being metabolized into the body of the fish. And there's two big reasons why we care about that. First of all, it means if you're a sea lion, pretty much anything you eat out in the ocean at this time of year has toxin in it. And so you're getting continuous doses of toxin, whether you're eating anchovy or cod or mackerel or salmon, there's toxin in everything. And the second one is that it suggests because it's being metabolized into the tissue of the fish, it's going to stay there longer. It's going to be longer than 24 hours. And so that starts to explain why we see things like bird mortalities and sea lion strandings after the bloom has gone away. Related to that, we've also been looking at the sediment, and we know that the sediment can hold toxin for at least 3 months after the bloom goes away. Within that sediment, if we look at the invertebrates, the crabs and snails and starfish that are in that sediment, they're consistently 10 times more toxic than the sediment themselves. And so they're concentrating that toxin, and the Dungeness is consuming that material. And so this is just some data that we have showing this was during the bloom, all the blues, and we see lots of toxin in all these invertebrates sitting down in the sediment. The reds are after the bloom went away, and so there's 1, 2, 3 months, and we're seeing toxin levels in the invertebrates in the sediment. They're just as high as when the bloom was around. And so this starts to explain why, even though the bloom went away maybe a couple months ago, many places along the California coast are still seeing Dungeness crab toxicity go up. And so it's quite possible that they're being exposed to this continuous source of domoic acid well after the bloom. And so the question that we've been asking is, well, is El Nino going to save us? It's going to disrupt the blob, but we know from looking at the historical record, these are temperature anomalies from Monterey, and so red is warmer than normal, blue is colder than normal. And if we look at, this was the 97, 98 El Nino, there's a smaller El Nino in the dashed line, there's another smaller El Nino there. And then if we look at, if we look at when we've had the big West Coast bloom events, if we go back in time, every time there's been a big warm anomaly, we've had a bloom over the whole West Coast. 2015 is by far the largest one we've ever seen, but it's happened pretty much every time there's an El Nino. And so if we go into 2016 and we really do have an El Nino that's as large or larger than 97, 98, we fully expect to have a bloom with toxin as large or larger than we saw this year. And that's starting to raise some serious concerns because a lot of the things we thought we understood about trophic transfer, we're starting to question about how long it takes that domoic acid to go through the system. So thanks very much.
Thank you. We will now open the floor to questions from any reporters in the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand, state your name and affiliation. Are there any questions from reporters in the room?
Hi, Amy West, freelance writer. Just a question, maybe it goes for all of you. I think I've asked this before of you, but the blob is known to probably have started because of the ridge. But what's not certain is that how the ridge formed, right? Because it looks very different than every other year or every other El Nino year.
So that ridge of high pressure off the West Coast does represent a whole series of different atmospheric patterns. So there hasn't really been a single ridge pattern. And yet, even though there have been these sort of differences that have contributed to persistently weird weather in the West and over the Northeast Pacific, those first 2 years that I showed tended to have that offshore position, and because of that tendency, it left this imprint on the ocean, cooled it, and because of the tendency for the next 2 years to have another pattern, it created the warm blob and record high temperatures in California 2 years in a row. And you were right, we don't know why the atmosphere got into those states and persisted for so long, but it certainly didn't because of the El Nino event that's underway right now. And as we said, the timing is wrong. People have identified some changes in tropical ocean temperatures that contribute to the kind of ridge pattern, but they don't have a name the way that El Nino does. It's not something that has come back and frequently influenced Pacific climate in a really robust way. So it is an open question, why the atmosphere has been stuck in these few number of states. But I would say that the history of kind of West Coast climate, California climate, is one of lots of variability, droughts that are caused, multi-year droughts that are caused by these kind of atmospheric patterns. We have created a longer-term history of temperatures in the blob region, and we see that, it frequently gets warm there for a year or two at a time, just not as extreme as in the last 2 years.
Hi, Mary Miller from the Exploratorium. I'm wondering, we're going through a regime shift in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, is that right? Where we might be changing from cool to warm. And is there any sense that that may contribute to more of these kind of patterns of warm water along the coast and, ecological impacts?
Yeah, so with that change that I showed from the sort of 2012 and 13 cold in the Northeast Pacific to warm starting in 2014, that looks a lot like this Pacific decadal oscillation pattern going from cold to warm states. What we know about the PDO is that it really gets pushed around by El Nino, and its predictability is very limited, but that warm state of the PDO is associated with lots of low pressure in the Northeast Pacific, not ridges off the West Coast. So it would not be something you'd expect with the PDO shift.
Zoe, are there any questions on the chat?
No.
Okay. Oh, we have another question back here.
Could you say a little bit, Allison Hawks, freelance KQED, wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are the real ecological implications of having this lingering domoic acid effect on the organisms in the water? And so, like, if it does last, for the period of time you're talking about, what is the repercussions of that in terms of what we would see down the road?
Well, probably the biggest repercussion is that it's gotten so far into the food web that marine mammals in particular are being exposed to continuous levels of domoic acid. And so there's been a lot of evidence showing, there was a press release and a science paper that's coming out this week, that there's long-term consequences for mammals. So otters, whales, California sea lions, where they actually get brain damage, essentially, from being exposed to domoic acid. And some of that could be acute exposure where you eat something that's super toxic, but it's also almost certainly linked to these lower doses that you're being exposed to over time. And so we know that there's been mass strandings of marine mammals in the last 2 years. A lot of that is due to the warm water, that they simply can't get enough food, but many of those animals have come in with domoic acid poisoning symptoms as well. Beyond that, this is the first time we've had a crab closure over the whole West Coast. And so when these blooms are this big and they last this long, we're going to see more closures. Cost of seafood is going to go up. It's going to be necessary to be tracking that more carefully. CDPH has changed the way they warn people. They no longer tell them, just decapitate the fish and gut it and you're fine. Same with the Dungeness. They went from saying, clean the viscera, to saying, don't eat the crab at all because the toxin is getting into the meat. And so those are the things that we're seeing that can happen when the domoic acid is around for so long at such high levels. I showed the picture of the aquarium. It's getting into aquaria systems. At Moss Landing Marine Labs, it got into their captive sea lion tank, and we're pretty sure that their captive sea lion got enough domoic acid to be poisoned, not from eating anything, but from simply being exposed to it in the water. And so these things are what's next, is that if you go from a bloom that's a week or two to a bloom that's several months long, these implications just build up and build up.
Are there any other questions from reporters in the room? Are there any other questions on the chat? Oh, okay, thank you. That concludes our press conference. Our next press conference is at 10:30, latest findings from NASA's Curiosity Mars rover mission 1 year at Mount Sharp.